Some days begin like any other, ordinary, unremarkable, soft with silence. But sometimes buried within that stillness, there's a story waiting to be unraveled. A story that doesn't arrive with loud announcements or grand gestures, but instead begins with the quiet steps of someone who doesn't need to be noticed to carry weight. Malik Anderson was that kind of person. He moved with a still grace, the kind that didn't demand attention, but somehow received it anyway. At just 17, Malik had mastered a presence that many adults spent decades trying to develop. Measured, intentional, and deeply rooted. Not flashy, not loud, but certain. This morning, as he walked through Gate B12 at Washington National Airport, he looked like any other well-mannered teenager heading home after a long week. He wore a clean navy hoodie, soft denim jeans, and a pair of white sneakers that were a little too bright not to be new. In his hand was a slim leather backpack, tucked beneath his shoulder without a wrinkle. But there was one thing that made him stand out, not to the casual eye, but to anyone who paid close enough attention. A first-class boarding pass, cleanly printed, bearing the number 2A. He didn't walk like someone entitled to luxury. He didn't carry himself like someone who had always known privilege. And that in itself was what made some people look twice. As Malik approached the gate, the attendant barely looked up. She scanned his ticket mechanically, as she had done with dozens before him. The green light blinked. She nodded. "Welcome aboard, sir," she said, not seeing him. "Thank you," Malik replied with quiet clarity, then stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, the hum of air conditioning mingled with the low murmur of early morning conversations. Flight 728 to Chicago was already half boarded, and the first-class section glowed softly under muted lighting. Businessmen in pressed suits tapped on laptops. A couple in their 60s flipped through magazines. A tired mother held a toddler against her shoulder, swaying gently. Malik made his way to seat 2A, a window seat. He placed his backpack in the overhead bin with care, then slid into the plush leather chair. His fingers brushed over the armrest as if absorbing the moment. There was no phone out, no selfies, no proof of presence, just stillness. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a well-thumbed copy of Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He opened it to the middle, leaned back, and began to read. It was at that moment that Rachel Morgan noticed him. She had just finished helping an older gentleman in the 3D store with his suitcase when her eyes drifted to Malik. Something about the scene didn't sit well with her, not the boy himself, but the combination. A teenager sitting in first class, alone, no parent in sight, no designer labels, no corporate briefcase, just a quiet presence and a book that didn't seem to fit the mold. Rachel had worked as a flight attendant for 17 years. She prided herself on instinct, on reading people, on catching things others didn't. It was what had earned her commendations in the past. But instinct isn't always the truth, and assumptions, especially the quiet ones, can cause more damage than any storm in the sky. She watched Malik for another few seconds, then adjusting her blazer and smoothing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, she approached seat 2A. "Good morning, sir," she said, her tone polite but firm. Malik looked up. "Morning," he replied, marking his page and closing the book. Rachel offered a tight smile. "Can I please see your boarding pass again? Just for verification." There was a brief pause, not of resistance but of quiet surprise. Malik reached into the pocket of his hoodie, pulled out the neatly folded pass, and handed it over. Rachel studied it. Seat 2A. Name, Malik Anderson. Everything was in order. Still, her gut said otherwise. "I just want to double-check with the manifest," she murmured, already turning to walk back to the galley. Malik nodded, unfazed, and reopened his book. Behind him, passengers watched, though no one spoke. A few exchanged glances. Others sank deeper into their routines. A minute passed, then another. Rachel returned, her face unreadable. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice louder now, cutting through the hum of conversation. "It seems there's been an issue with your booking. This seat appears to be assigned in error. I'll need you to move to the back of the aircraft." For a split second, the cabin felt frozen. Malik looked up once more. "My ticket is for 2A, he said evenly. "Yes, I understand," Rachel replied quickly. but it looks like it was mistakenly upgraded. We'll find you another seat, just not in this section." He didn't argue. He didn't ask to speak to a manager. He simply stared at her with an expression so calm, so devastatingly poised, that it made her shift slightly in her stance. Then, without a word, Malik stood, placed his book back into his backpack, and walked toward the back of the plane. The silence he left behind was heavier than any confrontation. Passengers turned their heads but said nothing. Rachel returned to her duties, lips pressed thin. But what she didn't know, what no one on that plane knew, was that the flight had just taken a turn. Not because of turbulence or delays or mechanical failures, but because a young man in a navy hoodie had been quietly, deliberately wronged. And someone, somewhere, had just received a text message that would ground more than just an airplane. At 7:12 a.m., 30,000 feet below cruising altitude and well before Flight 728's scheduled departure, a message left Malik Anderson's phone and reached a secure server in a high-rise office on the 41st floor of a building just blocks from Lake Michigan. It was a single line of text: Gate B12, discreet escalation requested, no outbursts, let it play. It bore no emotion, no elaboration, but for those familiar with the code, it said everything. Back in Washington, D.C., Rachel Morgan adjusted her blazer once again, continuing to smile at passengers while her pulse hummed with something she couldn't quite name. She had done her job, she reassured herself, checked the manifest, reassigned an invalid upgrade. Policy was policy. Still, a few passengers in first class seemed more alert than before, eyes occasionally flicking toward the aisle where Malik had once sat. The older woman in seat 1C shook her head slightly, murmuring under her breath. A businessman in 2D closed his laptop with more force than necessary. In row 17F, Malik sat silently against the window, his posture composed. No slouching, no sulking. He looked out at the tarmac as if studying the movement of the baggage carts. His fingers tapped once on his thigh, almost rhythmically. He was waiting. Not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for something larger than either of those things. Accountability. Chicago, Illinois, 7:14 a.m. CST. Inside the executive suite of AirVantage headquarters, where City Light met stainless steel, a man in a charcoal gray suit leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he read the incoming alert. The man's name was Calvin Anderson, CEO, architect of AirVantage's modern era, and Malik's father. He was not a man who raised his voice. But when Calvin moved, things followed, like gravity rearranging the universe. "Send it to my office," he said to his assistant, without breaking eye contact from the screen. Seconds later, a live feed from the aircraft's cabin camera began to stream in, a standard feature for incident verification, but one rarely accessed by top executives unless things were critical. There it was, crystal clear. Malik standing, calm, dignified, offering his boarding pass again. The flight attendant, the tone, the dismissal. "Who signed off on the new training modules?" Calvin asked suddenly, turning toward the window. His assistant stammered, caught off guard. "That would be Regional Director Calloway, sir, along with in-flight services leadership." "Tell Calloway to pick up his phone in 60 seconds, Calvin replied, his tone frost-sharp. "Then contact the FAA liaison. I want the flight flag, not grounded yet, just monitored." Back on Flight 728, 7:22 a.m., Rachel Morgan was preparing for takeoff, walking down the aisle with her checklist. But something about the energy in the plane had shifted. It was too quiet. Then came the ding. A call light. Row 17F. She blinked, surprised, walked back with confident steps. "Yes?" she asked, her voice still clipped with professionalism. Malik looked up, calm as ever. "May I have a cup of water, please?" The simplicity of the request disarmed her. "Of course." She returned with a cup moments later, but as she handed it to him, she caught sight of the book resting beside him. Between the World and Me, its cover worn, its edges dog-eared. She hesitated. "I've heard of that book," she said. Malik took the water without replying, just nodded. One polite nod, then looked away. Rachel stood there a moment longer, then turned, puzzled by a strange tightness in her chest she didn't want to acknowledge. 7:28 a.m. National Control Dispatch, AirVantage HQ. A quiet voice on the other end of the line responded crisply, "Yes, sir. Manifest revalidation initiated. All internal reports will be time-stamped and logged. I'm authorizing silent observation protocols. Make sure that includes crew-to-crew audio," Calvin said, "and send a message to Flight 728's captain. Inform him that the Anderson protocol has been triggered. He'll know what that means." A pause. "Understood, sir." The Anderson protocol wasn't a threat. It wasn't loud. It was a mirror. A real-time audit initiated in rare, high-risk moments where brand, reputation, and core values were in jeopardy. Calvin had only triggered it twice before. This would be the third. 7:31 a.m. Flight deck, Flight 728. Captain Elijah Brenner was a veteran, 2 decades in the sky, a calm leader, and a respected voice among his peers. As he prepared to initiate the final systems check, a quiet ping reached his cockpit display. He tapped it open, frowning. Anderson Protocol, active. He read the silent flag, eyes tightening. He'd flown with Calvin Anderson's son before. Quiet, respectful, always low-key, never once needed special treatment, never made noise. Captain Brenner turned to his co-pilot. "Hold the cabin announcement for a minute. I need to make a call." 7:35 a.m. Row 17F. Malik remained in his seat, sipping water, his book open but unread. He could feel it now. The tension, the shift. Somewhere above this plane, wheels were turning. Quietly, powerfully, and not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been told, implicitly or explicitly, "You don't belong here." He hadn't needed to shout. He just needed to stand up once and then sit down where they told him to go, and let the truth do the rest. As the engines began to hum and the runway loomed just ahead, a quiet stillness settled over Flight 728. Not the usual hush of passengers readying for takeoff, but something more taut, more suspended, like the moment between a judge's gavel and its echo. Malik Anderson sat motionless in 17F, his tray table up, seatbelt fastened, book closed now and resting in his lap like a statement that didn't need to be spoken. He didn't need to perform dignity. He was dignified. A quiet storm of composure, intentionality, and the kind of restraint that had been coded into him since boyhood, not because it came naturally, but because the world demanded it. He had been raised on "yes, sir," "no, ma'am," and "keep receipts." And in this moment, every lesson counted. In the front cabin, Rachel Morgan adjusted the cuffs of her blazer for the third time in 5 minutes, a gesture she hadn't noticed becoming compulsive. She was trying to move on, to mentally reassign the awkward encounter with the teenager as a misunderstanding, something she could file under routine conflict management. But the truth was less tidy. Something about the boy's calm, his deliberate silence, unsettled her. It wasn't defiance, it was worse than that. It was certain, a kind of quiet knowing she couldn't place but couldn't ignore. As the aircraft turned toward the runway, Captain Elijah Brenner cleared his throat and tapped the PA system. His voice came through smooth and composed, the kind of tone that settled nervous flyers and reinforced confidence in the unseen hands steering them through the clouds. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've just received a temporary air traffic hold from the tower. We'll remain grounded for a few minutes before we taxi to the runway. We appreciate your patience." He released the button, leaned back in his seat, and stared at the protocol message again. He didn't like it. Not because it was unjustified, but because it meant something had gone wrong at a level that shouldn't ever be breached. In the terminal below, the whispers were spreading. A silent cascade of texts, Slack pings, and internal alerts had begun weaving through AirVantage's network. Department heads started pausing mid-sentence. Legal advisors refreshed internal policy documents, and social media monitors tightened their scans for anything even remotely related to Flight 728. The storm hadn't broken yet, but the air was thick with its coming. Calvin Anderson, in his office in Chicago, stood facing the window, arms folded, eyes distant. Behind him, a large screen displayed a still from the cabin camera. Malik being told to move, a young man's face caught between obedience and disbelief, dignity and dismissal. It was a still image, but it burned like motion. "Has the captain confirmed visual contact?" Calvin asked. His chief of staff nodded. "Yes, sir. And he's activated the secure cabin review. We're monitoring everything." Calvin's jaw tightened. "No interference until landing. I want the full scope documented before we move." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every syllable moved like an order through glass. Back on the plane, Malik closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to center. His mother once told him that power wasn't always about force. It was about presence. About knowing who you were when the world insisted otherwise. "Let them see you," she'd said, "even when they try to unsee you." So he sat still as people occasionally glanced his way. Some curious, some uneasy, one or two even nodding at him faintly in quiet solidarity. Every minute that passed made the silence more potent. Rachel walked the aisle once more, but this time her gait lacked its earlier precision. When she passed Malik, she paused, just long enough for their eyes to meet. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but nothing came. He blinked slowly, not with contempt, but with a kind of acknowledgement that required no words. It was devastatingly gentle. Rachel turned away. 15 minutes into the delay, whispers among the first-class cabin began to swirl louder. A well-dressed woman in seat 1A leaned across the aisle and muttered, "They're saying someone in the back got kicked out of his seat, and now the airline's HQ is watching us?" A man beside her frowned. "I saw the kid. He didn't cause any trouble. Didn't even raise his voice." In row 3, a teenage girl refreshed her phone screen again and whispered to her brother, "I think he's somebody, like somebody important." The irony, of course, was that Malik never claimed to be. He didn't flash a name, didn't pull strings. He let the moment breathe, because he understood something fundamental. Systems reveal themselves when tested. The quiet buzz in the plane's atmosphere grew louder with each passing second. Captain Brenner received a follow-up message from control. "Proceed when cleared, no deviation, all cabin audio is being stored. Discretion advised." He exhaled slowly, nodding to himself. Then a second message pinged across internal communications, this one discreetly directed to Rachel Morgan. "Return to your jump seat. Remain professional. Passenger seating dispute under executive review." She read it once, then again. Her stomach turned. The words executive review didn't get thrown around lightly. The aircraft finally began to taxi forward, but it wasn't the same aircraft that had been ready to take off 40 minutes earlier. Every person aboard could feel it, an invisible tension now wrapping around them like pressure before a storm. Some passengers grew quiet, others scrolled social media compulsively, sensing that the flight they were on was no longer just a trip, but the beginning of a headline. And in row 17F, Malik Anderson exhaled softly, not in victory, not in vindication, just in readiness, because he knew what was coming next. Not wrath, not theater, but the consequence. The kind that didn't arrive loudly, the kind that waited until it had all the facts, and then moved like thunder. As Flight 728 ascended into the cloud-laced sky, the light turbulence seemed to mirror the tension still simmering in the cabin. Yet there was no panic, only silence. The kind of thick, unsettled quiet that comes not from fear, but from an acute awareness that something pivotal was underway. Flight attendants went through the motions, checking belts, offering drinks, and avoiding eye contact with the boy in 17F. And Rachel Morgan, once the confident lead attendant whose voice had carried over the intercom like polished certainty, now sat clipped into her jump seat, her eyes staring through the thin curtain ahead, but seeing nothing. Every so often, her hand drifted to the base of her neck, where a small silver pendant rested, a gift from her mother years ago, with the word grace etched faintly into the back. She had worn it for strength, but today it pressed against her like a question. Had she truly lived up to the meaning? Meanwhile, Malik sat calmly, hands folded gently in his lap. A warm paper cup of orange juice rested on his tray, untouched. There were no earbuds in his ears, no distractions in his hands. He was fully present, each breath slow, each movement measured. He knew better than to move hastily or fidget in situations like these. Even peace could be misconstrued if delivered too quickly. Dignity, when you look like him, had to be performed like art. quietly defiant, deliberately still. But the world outside the plane was not still. Across AirVantage headquarters in Chicago, Calvin Anderson, CEO, father, and the silent giant behind the airline's evolving code of ethics, had just finished a secure video call with legal and public relations teams. There were no raised voices, no desk pounding, only clarity. I want facts, full timeline, passenger and crew reports. Pull the cabin feed and mark the audio transcript, he said. No spin, no dilution. A young assistant entered quietly with a folder. Sir, she said, social media chatter is beginning. One post from seat 19A with the phrase, "They kicked him out of first class. He didn't fight, just stared back like he'd already won." It's going viral. Calvin took the folder, opened it slowly, and nodded. It's beginning. Back on the plane, the seatbelt sign pinged off. Passengers exhaled with mild relief. The routine had resumed, but the atmosphere had not returned to normal. Every flight had its rhythm, its pulse, like the unspoken energy of a room, and this one was fractured. Somewhere around row 6, a well-dressed man in a navy suit looked down at his phone, then over his shoulder toward the back. He just received a forwarded article link. CEO's son removed from first-class seat. Sources say internal audit underway. He turned to his seatmate and whispered, "I think we're flying with the Anderson kid." The woman blinked. "The Calvin Anderson?" The man nodded, lips parted slightly. "And that flight attendant?" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. The murmurs had begun. Rachel returned to her duties, but something had shifted. She moved more slowly, her voice now more subdued when offering drinks to the front cabin. Her fellow crew members noticed but said nothing. What could they say? They had seen the boy removed. They had watched her do it. And now, without a single outburst from him, the entire flight seemed to be rearranging itself around that moment. In 17F, Malik finally took a sip of his juice. He saw the glances. Some curious, others sympathetic, a few defensive. But he wasn't interested in performance. Not now, not yet. This wasn't about spectacle. It was about the pattern, about how many times dignity had to be proven, earned, and displayed like ID at the door. He thought of his father, of long, quiet walks through forest trails near Lake Michigan, where Calvin had taught him how to listen more than speak. Silence, his father had said, is the most underused form of power. Learn to wield it, and the world will speak for you. It was speaking now. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, a new message flashed across Rachel's crew tablet. Confidential, confirm passenger in 17F as Malik Anderson. Cease direct interaction unless urgent. All services to be rerouted via secondary crew. Rachel's heart sank. There it was, the confirmation she had been dreading, yet somehow expecting. Malik Anderson, Calvin Anderson's son, the same Calvin who had delivered the company's We Must Do Better initiative just last spring after a string of controversial incidents elsewhere in the industry. The same Calvin who had pledged transparency, bias training, and employee restructuring. The man who didn't fire people for optics, but for impact. And now she had removed his son from first class. Not with malice, not with violence, but with the kind of certainty born from unchecked assumptions. And that was the problem. In the rear galley, Rachel leaned against the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she held a carton of coffee creamers. The words of the message echoed in her mind. She wasn't angry, not yet. She was something worse, disoriented. Because if she was wrong about him, then what else had she been wrong about? She didn't want to be the villain of this story, but something in her gut told her she already was. Meanwhile, in the row ahead of Malik, a middle-aged woman in 16D turned slightly and whispered, "I'm sorry about earlier. That never should have happened." Malik looked at her, not unkindly. His nod was subtle, gracious even, but his eyes said more. Not cruelty, not even weariness, just experience. He'd lived this scene before. What no one on the plane yet knew was that by the time Flight 728 landed, a full executive memo would already be in circulation. By the time passengers disembarked, a press inquiry would be waiting. And before the next sunrise, Rachel Morgan's name would be trending. attached to headlines she would never have imagined. Not because Malik had said a word, but because he didn't have to. By the third hour of the flight, the stillness had settled into something heavier. Not fear, not hostility, just that uncanny collective awareness. Like everyone knew something larger than themselves was unfolding midair, and yet no one wanted to be the first to name it. Flight 728 sliced silently through the clouds, but back on the ground, its shadow was already eclipsing corporate boardrooms and legal departments. At the AirVantage Crisis Management Center in Chicago, a team of analysts had pulled every frame from the plane's surveillance footage. The audio had been filtered. The reports were cross-checked. The time-stamped decision to move Malik Anderson from his assigned first-class seat to economy had been traced to a single voice: Rachel Morgan's. Not because she was instructed, not because there was a policy breach, but because of what she believed when she looked at him. The irony was almost painful, and in that irony sat the real storm. Meanwhile, high above, Malik shifted his gaze out the window. Below him, a tapestry of snowy peaks gave way to soft valleys, the winter light spilling across the landscape in gold ribbons. It should have been peaceful, but inside his chest a quiet storm brewed, not of rage or bitterness, but of questions. Why did it still happen, even now, even to someone like him? Even when every credential, every inch of polish, every etiquette of silence had been perfected. If not him, then who? He thought of the young boy back home, his cousin Zaire, only 11, who'd once asked him if rich people ever got kicked off planes too. Malik had laughed then, but it wasn't funny anymore. The truth was harder to explain than the myth of progress. A quiet knock interrupted his thoughts. A different flight attendant, a younger one named Kayla, stood at his aisle. She leaned in with a small smile, holding a plate. "Mr. Anderson, the kitchen put together something warm for you. It's our duck confit with couscous and winter greens from first class. If you're hungry." Her voice was calm, but her eyes told a different story. She was trying, and she wanted him to know that. This, too, was part of the performance, the repair. Malik accepted the tray with a slight nod. "Thank you," he said, not because he needed the food, but because he knew what that moment cost her. She was the first person on that flight to speak his name. From the front galley, Rachel watched the exchange in silence. It stung, though she couldn't say why. Maybe it was the ease with which Kayla had done what she hadn't. Or maybe it was the growing awareness that the damage had already been done, and no amount of five-star cuisine could undo it. By the time they began descending toward Chicago O'Hare, the outside world had caught fire. Multiple news outlets had picked up the story, though not through the airline itself. It was a teenage influencer seated in 21A who had posted a vague but sharp caption to her Instagram story. "Can't believe I watched a black teen get downgraded from 1A to economy in 2025. In silence. Who are these people?" The post included a blurry photo, Rachel's silhouette mid-sentence, pointing toward the rear, and just behind her, a tall teen was standing quietly, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder. Within minutes, it was reposted. Within an hour, it had crossed over to Twitter, then TikTok. The comments came like waves. "I thought we were past this. Wait, he's Calvin Anderson's son? He didn't even argue? Man just took it? That's power. Fire the whole damn crew, start over." This is why representation matters. He made them shake without saying a word. The pressure was building long before the wheels hit the tarmac, and as the aircraft touched down at O'Hare, the subtle shift in cabin energy was unmistakable. People sat straighter. Flight attendants moved more cautiously. Eyes darted. Phones lit up. Rachel unbuckled her harness and stood, her hands trembling as she reached for the intercom. The landing announcement sounded practiced. Too practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The local time is 4:38 p.m. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft comes to a full stop and the captain turns off the seatbelt sign." Her voice trailed off as she noticed the co-pilot watching her from the front. His expression wasn't cruel, just knowing. She had become the story, and the story had already escaped her. As passengers filed out, Malik remained seated, waiting for the aisle to clear. He wasn't rushing. He had no desire to be paraded. As he finally stood, a woman in row 15 gently touched his arm. "Your father's changed a lot of lives," she whispered, "and so have you. Don't let them forget that." He gave her the faintest smile, that kind of smile that wasn't meant to be loud, but lasting. He exited with quiet poise, nodding once to the crew. Rachel didn't meet his eyes, but Kayla did, and in that glance something human passed between them. Recognition, apology, and the shared weight of a moment that would not be forgotten. In the terminal, a small team in dark suits waited near the gate. They did not approach with fanfare, only subtle deference. Malik walked through them without pause. One of them touched his earpiece and said quietly, "He's clear," proceeding to the vehicle. Rachel stood at the jet bridge as the last passenger left. Her heart thudded, her uniform collar suddenly feeling tight. A notification pinged on her crew device. Mandatory review, internal ethics violation, incident 728. Ground inquiry initiated. Stand by for immediate debrief. She stared at the screen. The letters blurred. Behind her, Kayla paused. "You okay?" she asked softly. Rachel didn't answer right away. Then, "I thought I was." And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't sure what that meant anymore. Chicago's skies were steely and dim, like the whole city had absorbed the tension of the news cycle. Snowflakes floated sideways in the wind as Malik stepped into the sleek black SUV waiting just outside Terminal 5. The driver said nothing, only nodded respectfully as Malik slid into the back seat, the door closing with a quiet finality behind him. Inside the vehicle, the mood was heavy but insulated, a quiet sanctuary after the storm. Across from him sat an older man in a tailored navy coat, eyes sharp, voice calm. "Son," he said simply. Malik met his father's gaze. "Hi, Dad." Calvin Anderson, one of the most prominent CEOs in the aviation world, didn't smile. He didn't raise his voice. But in the stillness of that cabin, the weight of legacy was unmistakable. Not just power, but responsibility and heartbreak. "I didn't want to make a scene," Malik said, the words tight in his throat. "You didn't," Calvin replied, "but the world noticed anyway. And that might just be louder." There was a pause. Then Malik asked the question that had been clawing at him since the moment he was told to move. "Why do I still have to be quiet to be heard?" Calvin exhaled slowly. "Because too many people are still afraid of the sound of our truth, and because we were raised to survive before we were ever taught to speak." Malik nodded. The SUV pulled into the underground parking lot of a glass skyscraper downtown. AirVantage's corporate headquarters. Not through the front, through the private executive entrance. Inside, a war room was already in motion. The head of communications, legal counsel, and ethics compliance officers, all present, all bracing. Screens displayed timelines, news headlines, social media explosions, legal exposure. Brand risk metrics are climbing like a fever. But when Calvin Anderson walked in, the room went quiet. He wasn't just the CEO, he was a father. And this wasn't just a crisis, it was personal. He stood at the head of the long conference table. Behind him, Malik remained composed but distant, his presence not a threat, but a mirror, and none of them wanted to look too closely. "Let me be clear," Calvin began, his voice steady, cool but sharpened by something far deeper than corporate strategy. "This is not about damage control. This is about accountability." The room held its breath. "We didn't just inconvenience a passenger. We degraded him. We reinforced every toxic bias we claimed to fight against. And we did it to a black teenager who did everything right." He sat quietly in his assigned seat, who asked for nothing, and yet someone decided he didn't belong. He let the silence hang before continuing. "This company has spent millions on diversity training, public campaigns, and partnerships. But when it mattered, when no one was looking, we failed." A woman from legal raised her voice cautiously. "We're still evaluating liability, Mr. Anderson, but we may be able to settle quietly." "Don't!" Calvin cut in sharply. "Don't reduce this to a settlement. This is not about silencing a headline. It's about facing the truth." He turned slightly, meeting every eye in the room. Effective immediately, Flight Supervisor Rachel Morgan is suspended pending full investigation. All crew members will undergo mandatory retraining, and we will launch an independent audit of all recorded bias complaints in the last 5 years. Everyone, no exceptions. The head of PR scribbled frantically. The HR director looked pale. And I'll be giving a statement, Calvin added. Live tonight. Gasps rippled quietly. Malik blinked. You sure about that? Calvin glanced at his son. We asked the world to trust our values. Now we show them. That evening at 8:12 p.m. CST, the country stopped scrolling for a moment. The AirVantage website went black, then cut to a live stream. Calvin Anderson stood alone on screen, framed by the company logo but no script, no teleprompter. Just him, a CEO, a father, a black man. He spoke clearly, without spin. Today, my son was asked to move from his assigned first-class seat because someone decided he didn't look the part. That decision was not based on policy, it was based on perception, and that perception is where racism lives, in the space between what is seen and what is assumed. To every young person who has ever been told to shrink themselves to fit into systems that weren't built for them, know this: you do not have to disappear to belong. You do not have to be silent to be dignified. As CEO, I take responsibility. As a father, I carry the pain. But as a leader, I promise this: change will not be cosmetic. It will be structural. Starting now. By the time the statement ended, the video had already been clipped and reposted across every platform. It was raw, unscripted, and people were watching. Inside her small apartment on the South Side, Rachel Morgan sat on the edge of her couch, watching the broadcast on her tablet. Her mouth was dry. Her phone had stopped ringing hours ago, not because people weren't calling, but because she turned off the ringer. The truth was too loud already. Her sister had texted earlier. They're saying it's you. Is it true? She hadn't replied. Now as she watched the man she didn't even recognize on that flight, the boy she dismissed, speak through his father's voice to the entire nation, her hands shook. She hadn't meant harm, but harm didn't need intention. It just needed ignorance and silence. Suddenly, there was a knock at her door. Startled, she rose, opened it. A woman stood there, older, calm. It was her neighbor, Mrs. Laurel. Kind eyes, salt and pepper hair. I brought you some tea, she said gently. Rachel tried to speak, but her voice cracked. Mrs. Laurel didn't push. She just handed her the cup, then added quietly, sometimes the hardest truth is the one that reflects us. And then she left. Back at headquarters, Calvin walked into his office and closed the door. Alone again with Malik. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Malik said, You didn't have to go that far. Calvin turned, his face unreadable. I didn't go far enough, he replied. But maybe now, others will. And for the first time since the flight began, Malik exhaled. Not because it was over, but because something had finally started. When the sun rose over Chicago the next morning, it wasn't the cold or the headlines that woke people. It was the sound of reckoning. Across news channels, social media, and boardrooms from coast to coast, Calvin Anderson's speech had set off not just conversation, but confrontation. For once, the story wasn't just another footnote in the endless churn of outrage. It had a face, a father, a son, a voice that refused to stay quiet. Malik hadn't meant to become a symbol. He still didn't want to be one. He sat quietly by the window of the 37th floor of the AirVantage headquarters, looking down at the city below. He'd been offered a temporary space, technically a quiet room for senior guests, but no one dared occupy it after last night. Not while Malik was in it. He sipped his coffee, black and cooling fast, while the world buzzed beyond the glass. Across the city, something else was happening. At Gate 12 of O'Hare International, a young black girl named Jada, dressed in a simple blue hoodie and carrying a violin case, stepped up to the boarding line for Flight 882. She held a first-class ticket. Her parents had saved months for her to fly in comfort after winning a regional music competition. The gate agent scanned her boarding pass, then paused. For a second, Jada's heart skipped, but then the agent smiled gently. Congratulations on the win, she said, waving Jada through, and welcome aboard, Miss Adams. It was a small moment, but these moments were multiplying, not because racism had vanished overnight, but because someone had finally said aloud what many had lived quietly for years, and people were listening. Back in the headquarters, Calvin Anderson's executive team gathered once again. This time, the mood wasn't just tense, it was transformed. For the first time, people weren't simply protecting the brand, they were protecting the mission. We've received over 200 personal accounts of in-flight discrimination in the past 12 hours, said Ayanna Bell, the new interim director of ethics and accountability. Her words were firm, her tone unapologetic. Many of these were buried in closed HR files. Others never even made it that far. People were scared, dismissed, ignored. She slid a folder onto the table. Not anymore. Heads turned. In the folder were testimonies from flight attendants, passengers, even pilots, some recounting microaggressions, others recalling flagrant bias. A few had names, others were anonymous. But all of them shared a common thread. The system had protected the company, not the people. Calvin entered the room just as Ayanna finished. He didn't sit. He stood. From today forward, Ma, he said, we are no longer a company that reacts. We are a company that prevents. He turned to Ayanna. Draft a reform plan, independent oversight, passenger advocacy, anonymous reporting channels, real authority to act. Ayanna didn't blink. Already started. Outside the building, protest signs had begun to appear, not out of anger, but out of support. High school students marched quietly. Church groups showed up at terminals handing out cards that read, "Every seat is a right, not a privilege." A viral video showed a group of AirVantage employees on break forming a silent circle at Gate 27, each holding a printed copy of Calvin's speech. For Rachel Morgan, the woman at the heart of the scandal, the world had gone strangely silent. Her employee badge had been deactivated. Her name had leaked online. Her sister stopped answering her calls. But the worst part wasn't the backlash. It was the silence from within. She sat alone in her apartment, watching clip after clip of Malik's composed face, of Calvin's words, of thousands of strangers defending a teenager she had dismissed with a single sentence. "You don't belong here." Those 5 words were now etched into headlines, analysis pieces, editorials. But what haunted her most was how easily they had come out of her mouth. That night she opened her laptop. She wrote a letter. It wasn't addressed to HR. It wasn't for the media. It was for Malik. "I know an apology can't undo what I did, but I want you to know I see it now. I see the way I carried assumptions into my job, like carry-on luggage I never unpacked. I told myself I followed procedure, but I wasn't following policy. I was following bias. I'm sorry, not just because I hurt you, but because I've been part of a system that hurts many like you. I want to do better, and I hope that someday you'll believe people like me can change." She didn't sign it. She didn't send it. But for the first time, she read it aloud and cried. The next morning, Malik sat in a private meeting with a committee of AirVantage board members who had flown in from around the country. Most were white, all were older, some were skeptical, others looked uncomfortable. But Calvin had invited Malik not as a symbol, but as a witness. As the young man stood before them, the silence in the room felt familiar. But this time, it was listening. Malik didn't give a speech. He told a story. "I was 8 the first time I flew alone," he said. "I was wearing a blazer. My mom ironed it just for the flight. I was so proud I kept touching the buttons. But when I sat in my seat, a woman across the aisle pressed the call button and said, 'I think someone's in the wrong place.'" He paused. No theatrics. No tears. Just the truth. "I didn't say anything back then. I thought maybe I was in the wrong place." He looked around the room. "But I'm not 8 anymore, and I know exactly where I belong." For a moment, no one spoke. Then the oldest board member, a woman with white hair and a sharp gaze, stood and said, "You're right. And from today, so will everyone else." That afternoon, the airline unveiled its new internal campaign, "Mujure Rightful Seat." It wasn't just a hashtag, it was a promise. Posters appeared in every airport. A quiet redesign of protocols began. New uniforms for flight attendants included small name badges that read, "Every seat, every story, every right." And at the heart of it all was a simple image, Malik, seated quietly, looking forward. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't protested with fists. He had just sat still, and that stillness had moved the world. For a brief moment, it felt like calm had returned to the skies. The Pumish Rightful Seat initiative was gaining ground. AirVantage's social media pages, once filled with angry comments, were now brimming with cautious optimism. Passengers were sharing positive stories. Employees began using internal feedback tools that had long been ignored. Ayanna Bell's reform unit had already started retraining department heads, and a new team was reviewing over a decade's worth of employee complaints with fresh eyes. But as anyone in aviation knows, clear skies can hide sudden storms. In a quiet corner of an upscale townhouse in Alexandria, Virginia, the glow of a laptop screen lit up the face of a man who had not appeared in any of the recent stories. His name was Richard Calloway, former senior vice president of AirVantage's corporate affairs, recently forced into early retirement just weeks before Calvin's restructuring began. He wasn't forced out for wrongdoing, at least not officially, but Calvin had made it clear in private that anyone with a record of burying complaints or obstructing change had no place in the company's new future. And Richard had spent his career doing exactly that, smooth-talking reporters, covering internal scandals with polished press statements, and ensuring the company's stock remained unshaken no matter what truth tried to surface. Now, watching Malik's face on the company homepage, Richard sipped his bourbon slowly. "They're turning him into a brand," he muttered. His fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard. He wasn't done with AirVantage. Not yet. Inside an encrypted channel used by certain former employees, Richard shared a carefully crafted narrative, one that questioned the legitimacy of the Andersons, of the investigation, and even of Malik's story. He cited undisclosed security footage and floated the idea that the incident had been orchestrated for personal gain. "Ask yourself," he wrote in the message board, "why would the son of a wealthy executive need to fly alone in coach before being bumped up to first class? Why now? Why so public? And how convenient that cameras were already rolling." The message spread fast, picked up by fringe blogs, then reshared by anonymous social media accounts. Within 24 hours, the conspiracy theory had a name: Trower's Stage for Sympathy. At first, the company brushed it off. Just noise. But then came the edits. Clips of Malik's testimony were sliced and stitched to look dramatic, rehearsed. A comment he had made weeks earlier about his father being used to the spotlight was taken out of context and reposted with captions like, "Scripted?" A YouTuber with 2 million followers released a video titled, "The Truth About the VIP Teen, What They're Not Telling You." It included grainy footage of Malik at the gate, edited to look like he had initiated the confrontation. It was fake, but it spread like wildfire. Ayanna watched it at 1:37 a.m., eyes burning from fatigue, then called Calvin immediately. "We need to get ahead of this," she said. Calvin, still in his office, leaned forward. "Damage control?" "No," Ayanna said sharply. "Truth control." By sunrise, Malik's phone had exploded with texts. "Are you okay? Did you see the video? Why aren't you responding?" He didn't know what to say. He had never asked for any of this. Never sought fame. Never prepared for an attack. For the first time, Malik felt the weight of being more than just himself. He was a symbol now, something people either uplifted or tore apart. His father noticed the change immediately. "Malik," Calvin said quietly, "you don't owe anyone your pain, but you also don't run from your truth." Malik turned to him. "What if they don't believe it anymore?" Calvin didn't hesitate. "Then we don't speak to convince them. We speak so others like us know they're not alone." That same day, Malik recorded a short video in a plain room, seated at a table with no logos, no production. He spoke softly. "There's a rumor going around that I staged what happened to me, that I did it for attention, for money, for power. I won't dignify that with a defense, because I remember how it felt when I was told, 'You don't belong here.' And I know millions of people, kids, adults, families, have heard those words in all kinds of places, schools, offices, airports, boardrooms. I'm not perfect. I'm not trying to be a hero. I just wanted to go home, and I want everyone to feel like they deserve to get there with dignity." He paused. "So no," I didn't stage anything. But if standing up for myself stages a change for others, then I won't apologize for that either. Within minutes, the video was reposted across platforms. By noon, celebrities and politicians were quoting it. By evening, the conspiracy accounts had started to backpedal, some deleting posts, others going silent. But Richard wasn't done. He had one last move, an email, carefully drafted, sent to an investigative journalist known for publishing leaks. It included excerpts from an old HR file Calvin had once personally sealed, a file involving a discrimination claim that the company never properly addressed. The twist? It was from years ago, filed by a white employee who claimed a black supervisor had inverted racism against her. It was designed to create false equivalence. To say, see, this happens both ways. The journalist, however, didn't bite. Instead, she emailed Calvin. I thought you should see what's coming, she wrote. Someone's trying to use this to flip the story. Calvin responded only with, let them try. The truth doesn't blink. That night, AirVantage issued a new policy. All historical claims, regardless of race, rank, or timeline, would be reviewed by an independent civil equity board, formed in partnership with national justice organizations. They weren't just playing defense anymore. They were rewriting the rules. And while the turbulence had begun to show again, the plane wasn't going down. It was just adjusting course towards something better. The hearing chamber was sterile, lined with steel and silence. Yet the tension inside pulsed like static before a storm. The U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Aviation Oversight rarely held public hearings for individual airlines, let alone cases involving private citizens. But the sheer viral magnitude of the Euroshat rightful seat movement and the wave of whistleblowers following AirVantage's internal reform had made this unavoidable. News networks branded it the flight that changed the skies. Malek sat at the front row of the panelist section, his back straight, but his hands gently trembling beneath the table. Ayanna sat beside him, poised and unreadable. Calvin Anderson sat one seat down, his expression stoic, jaw locked in quiet resolve. Across the aisle sat members of the old guard, former AirVantage executives, PR strategists, union reps, even Richard Calloway, whose leaked smear campaign had backfired but still managed to stir enough doubt that his presence had been requested. But this hearing wasn't just about Malik anymore. It was about a culture, a pattern, and a reckoning long overdue. Senator Lorraine Moss, a seasoned voice of conscience in the committee chair, opened the session with simple words. This is not a courtroom, but make no mistake, truth will be cross-examined here today. The first witness was not Malik. It was a woman named Karen Ellis, a former gate supervisor at a regional airport. She was white, middle-aged, and looked uncomfortable under the lights. Her voice, however, was steady. I'm here today because I saw things I didn't speak up about when I should have, she said. Not all of it was overt, but it was real. The profiling, the double standards, the quiet nudges to reassign a black family to the back during overbooked scenarios. It was all there, hidden in procedures, smoothed over with company policy. I went along with it. I regret that deeply. The silence that followed her confession was almost reverent. Then came a string of witnesses. An Asian American pilot denied promotion despite exemplary records, a Latina attendant penalized for using Spanish in announcements, and a gay black employee who had been mysteriously transferred after reporting harassment. Each story chipped away at the facade of plausible deniability that the airline had hidden behind for years. Then finally, Malik was called forward. The cameras clicked. Millions were watching live. Malik took a slow breath, then stepped into the light. His voice didn't shake, but it didn't boom either. It was real. I never wanted this seat at the table. I never wanted to be the face of a movement. I just wanted to get home. But when I was told I didn't belong, something inside me cracked open, and I realized that staying silent wouldn't fix anything. So I spoke. He paused. The room listened. This hearing isn't about punishing one flight attendant, or praising me, or clearing a company's name. It's about deciding what kind of country we want to be when we're 35,000 feet in the air, when there's no exit, no safe corner, no place to hide from judgment. I don't think people like me should have to prove that we belong in a seat we paid for. Dignity should be standard, not a luxury. A few seats back, Richard Calloway smirked slightly, then leaned into his mic. "I'd like to remind the committee," he said smugly, "that this young man's father is a powerful executive, that the resources behind his image have created a skewed narrative." Senator Moss didn't blink. "And I'd like to remind you, Mr. Calloway, that access to dignity should not depend on wealth, race, or connections, but on the truth, which, from what we've seen today, your department spent years suppressing." A sharp gas swept the chamber. Ayanna smiled. Just barely. Then came the final twist. Senator Moss turned to Calvin Anderson. "Mr. Anderson, were you aware that your son's incident was being used by corporate actors in an attempt to destabilize your reform efforts?" Calvin answered, calm but firm. "I was. And I also knew that telling the truth might cost us. That's what truth does. It threatens comfort. But comfort has no place in justice." He gestured toward Malik. "What my son endured is not rare. What makes it powerful is that, for once, someone paid attention." The next morning, headlines swept the nation. Airline discrimination finally faces Congress. Teen's testimony goes viral. Again, dignity should be standard. Senate calls for national airline oversight reforms. The backlash came fast, but this time, it wasn't directed at Malik. It was aimed squarely at the system. Executives implicated by the whistleblowers were placed under federal review. Richard Calloway was formally indicted for falsifying reports and intimidating witnesses. And AirVantage's stock? It dipped for a moment, then rose, because the public trusted what they saw. A company that had once shamed a teenager for quietly existing in a seat of privilege had become a symbol of how to change. The sun rose golden over Washington, D.C., casting light across the Capitol dome. But on this day, the brightest spotlight wasn't on the halls of politics. It was on a boy who never asked for attention. Malik Anderson stood quietly backstage at the Kennedy Center. In just minutes, he would take the stage, not as a protester, not as a viral headline, but as the recipient of the inaugural National Courage and Citizenship Award, presented by the President of the United States. The event wasn't meant to be flashy. It wasn't about optics. It was about honoring voices that demanded better from the world and paid the price to get there. As he adjusted his tie, Malik looked down at the small gold pin clipped to his lapel. A gift from Ayanna. The words inscribed were simple. Dignity should be standard. He smiled. The past months had been a blur. The Senate hearings had set off a domino effect. Civil rights leaders, corporate reformers, educators, and media joined the cause. What began as a viral clip of a quiet black teen being removed from a seat became a national examination of systemic bias across industries, not just airlines, but healthcare, education, and housing. The Malik Bill, a bipartisan airline passenger protection act, passed with overwhelming support. It mandated transparency in ticketing and crew conduct, created an independent review board for racial profiling complaints, and funded diversity retraining across federal transportation sectors. But even more powerful than the law was the culture shift. Airports began posting signs that read, "Every passenger deserves to arrive with dignity." Some mocked it. Others embraced it. But the conversation had changed, and Malik, still just 17, had become the face of that conversation. As he walked onto the stage to thunderous applause, he didn't think about revenge or vindication. He thought about his seat. Seat 2A, a chair on a plane that had become a symbol of where the country had been and where it needed to go. He took the podium and looked out at a crowd that included senators, pilots, students, janitors, CEOs, and even the reformed leadership of AirVantage, who sat silently in the second row. Among them was Tanya McCree, the new VP of Equity Initiatives, a black woman who used to be a flight attendant. Poetic. Malik cleared his throat. A seat is never just a seat. It's what we attach to it that gives it power. I was judged not by my presence, but by assumptions about what my presence meant. That day I lost a seat, but I gained something bigger. A voice. He paused. I don't stand here because I'm special. I stand here because a system failed in public, and this time, people refused to look away. Applause. And to the kids watching who are told they don't belong, you do. You belong in every room, on every plane, in every board meeting, on every ballot. Not because someone lets you, but because you were always meant to. As he stepped back, the entire audience rose. It wasn't just a standing ovation, it was a reckoning. In the weeks that followed, more airlines adopted new equity programs. Schools began teaching a case study called The Flight Seat That Sparked Reform. Malik's story became part of the public curriculum in several states. AirVantage, now under a restructured board, announced a partnership with the Anderson Initiative, a foundation founded by Calvin and Malik, offering scholarships to marginalized youth pursuing careers in aviation, civil rights law, and public policy. Meanwhile, a familiar face reappeared. Michelle Green, the flight attendant who had removed Malik that fateful day. She had gone silent after her resignation. But one evening, she requested a private meeting with Malik. The moment was awkward, tense. Michelle had aged. Her eyes were softer, worn by guilt. But when she spoke, her voice was raw. "I didn't see you that day," she said. "Not really. I saw a story I made up in my head. And I'm sorry it took the whole country to open my eyes." Malik didn't offer forgiveness on the spot, but he nodded, slowly. "Then use your voice now, for someone else." Michelle later became a training consultant, helping educate future airline staff on implicit bias, using her own story as a cautionary tale. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was progress. 1 year later, Malik sat in seat 2A again, this time on a different airline, headed to Harvard for his first semester as a student in the Department of Government and Social Ethics. A young black girl across the aisle looked at him, wide-eyed. "Are you that guy?" she whispered. Malik smiled. "No," he said. "I'm just someone sitting where I'm supposed to." He looked out the window as the plane began its taxi. The clouds were waiting, but this time they weren't above him. They were part of his path. Message of the story and real-life lessons. Dignity isn't a reward, it's a right. Malik's quiet resistance reminded us that how we treat others when no one's watching reflects our truest selves. Discrimination thrives in routine, but so can justice if we choose it. Power can come from silence, but change comes from courage. Malik never yelled. He never cursed. He simply stood his ground. And when the world leaned in to listen, he spoke truth, not just to power, but for everyone who's ever been quietly dismissed. Systems don't change with apologies. They change with action. From legislation to training reform to culture shifts in corporate boardrooms. Real change requires facing the hard truths and rebuilding from the inside out.